Thank you very much, and a welcome to the choir, and a welcome to everybody here this morning. It's lovely that people are finally arriving. Giving people refuge and a home, how can we manage? That is the name of the forum this morning. At the Halle Festival, A Wider Outlook Works. My name is Albert Hinz. I am the Theological Vice President of the Evangelical Church of Westphalia and responsible for the topic of social responsibility. So I'm going to be your moderator today. I'm looking forward to our guest speakers. They're sitting right there. The chair of the Council of the Evangelical Church in Germany and Bishop of Bavaria, Heinrich Bedford Storm. Doris Peschke, who's the director of the Church's Commission for Migrants in Europe in Brussels. Volker Maria Hügel from the agency Pro Asyl, Citizens Initiative. And our Federal Minister, Mr. Altmaier, is going to join us soon. These are our guests this morning. I, too, would like to welcome you. Good morning, everybody.
Guten Morgen. Wir haben vielleicht hier in diesem Stadion.
Yesterday, perhaps you were at the wonderful concert here in this very same stadium. It was so exciting, and many of the texts of the hymns and songs really touched our hearts, and it could be that you had a very short night, but now you're gradually turning up on this Saturday morning. And we would like to begin by a moment of stillness. We're going to say a psalm together. And we're going to perhaps sing the refrain with it, and also hear a Bible text that I'd like to share some ideas on. So, we join together today in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. The choir has wonderfully sung, and we're going to hear them once again.
Guzla
Wir wollen Worte aus dem Psalm 85.
Let us listen to the Psalm 85.
Ich beginne und bitte Sie, die eingerückten Zeilen zu lesen.
I'm going to start and would ask you to read alternate verses. Lord, you were favorable to your land. You restored the fortunes of Jacob. You forgave the iniquity of your people. You pardoned all their sin. You withdrew all your wrath. You turned from your hot anger. Restore us again, O God of our salvation, and put away your indignation toward us. Will you be angry with us forever? Will you prolong your anger to all generations? Will you not revive us again, so that your people may rejoice in you? Show us your steadfast love, O Lord, and grant us your salvation. Amen.
Liebe Schwestern und Brüder,
Sisters and brothers,
wir sind an diesem Wochenende hier im
this weekend, here in the Jerry Weber Stadium, we're in a situation of test in our country. It's also a test for Europe and for the whole world. Last year, in Germany, a revolution of empathy took place. Spontaneously, millions of people were touched, where they were touched by the fate of people who were fleeing from terror, violence, and other threats to life and limb. And many people are still active in assisting refugees, and the concert yesterday was rather like a concert of gratitude for all the volunteers who continue to do such good work. At the same time, many people are uncertain. Some of them are becoming rather anxious as to whether we can manage with the challenges, whether we can cope with the refugees who arrived last year, and it could be that large numbers are still going to come. And the question is whether they can be integrated. And some who have little in this country are afraid that that little will be taken away from them, and others who have much want to hang on to it. They fear that life as they know it here, the prosperity they enjoy, might be lost. And that means that right-wing populists are acquiring more adherents. The basic orientation of solidarity with the weak, with the disadvantaged, and the kindness to people that has strengthened our country is now being questioned by these populists. Frequently, they incite aggression against strangers and sometimes even say that that is being Christian. And sometimes we see the refugee camps burning. Violence is visible against refugees. They're even shouted at when they arrive. And recently, there's been a great deal of lack of security in people's minds. Some of them are losing their orientation. And rarely was it so important for us to draw from the sources of orientation that have guided us in our country and continent through all the errors and disasters of history. The concept of the Christian West should be used very cautiously, because all too often it's used for triumphalist claims on power and as a way of excluding people. Our European culture is then assumed to be homogeneous, but that's never been the case. Certainly not, because recently this concept has been used increasingly in order to discredit other religions like Islam. Certain countries even refuse to accept any Muslim refugees because they claim that they want to defend the Christian West. It's not enough to shake your head at these countries or to wrinkle your nose at their behavior. Rather, we must come into dialogue with them and sit down and say, what do we mean by the Christian West? And what is the content of Judeo-Christian tradition? And what orientation can be given by the very wellsprings of this tradition that people are looking for today? Now, one of the biblical texts that's most suitable for this comes from the book of the prophet Isaiah. It stands for a host of other texts in the Bible, in both the Old and New Testaments, that take a similar line. It's a text about humanitarian assistance. It's a text about combating the causes of refugee movements. It's a text about justice. And it's a text about the good life. It's about happiness. Most of you will be familiar with these verses. Perhaps you've read them or heard them many times. I speak of Isaiah chapter 58, 7-12. Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe him and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood, then your light will break forth like the dawn and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer, and you will cry for help, and he will say, here I am. If you do away with the yoke of oppression with the pointing finger and malicious talk, and if you spend yourselves in behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness, and your night will become like the noonday. The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land and will strengthen your frame, and you'll be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. What touches me listening to these words from the book of Isaiah, and what has always fascinated me, is that it's not a text about shortage, it's a text about abundance. And it's not just a utopia, dreaming, remote from life. There are so many historical examples showing how full of experience these words are. Yearning for justice, for righteousness, that was the driving force of one of the greatest cultural achievements of humanity, the rule of law. The rule of law has proven more sustainable and more humane, in fact, than the rule of the strongest and the most ruthless. Social balance has been a driving force for affluence not just for a handful of people, but for all. And the attempt to have everybody share fairly in social processes is the most effective program to overcome violence. New empirical studies show that the level of satisfaction of a society doesn't depend on the absolute level of material prosperity. Rather, it depends on the limitation of inequality. Only to a certain relatively limited level of material well-being means all the same a growth in material resources and a growth in satisfaction with life. And looking at the satisfaction of the whole society, It's much more important to iron out the differences between the social classes. And the most exciting thing that academics have discovered here is that even the richest third of society is more satisfied in societies when the social balance is particularly healthy. These studies confirm the old biblical guidance, where the well-being of a society is measured by the fate of its most disadvantaged members. Share your food with the hungry and provide the poor wanderer with shelter. If you see a homeless person, take them in. If you see a naked person, clothe them. Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear.
Warum begreifen wir nicht,
why don't we understand
uns Gerechtigkeit tut?
How good righteousness and justice does us, and how dangerous injustice is? What will future generations think of a day like this, where worldwide there's more wealth than ever before, and where nevertheless 24,000 people die because they haven't got enough to eat or haven't got enough medicine, even though there's plenty there worldwide? Many of them are children, and nobody can say that it's their fault. Will our posterity, the people to come, ask how it was possible? How could you, they might ask. How could you sit back, watch, and accept that? Why didn't you manage, with all that wealth, to organize a world in which every single person could live in dignity? And before God's judgment, nobody is going to be interested in what we've achieved in our professions, what we have represented in terms of social status, or what else we have achieved. Rather, it will be how we got on with the least of our sisters and brothers. That is what will interest God on the last day. And whether we have noticed them at all, whether we've been interested in them, whether we've thought of them when we talk all the time about a global economy and economic cycles and growth dynamics. Have we forgotten them then, or will they be the guiding factor? If you keep all this in mind, honestly, if you are sensitive in going through the world, anyone who does this and is touched by injustice could indeed despair, could really lose courage, because the deep awareness of the truth of God's judgment can come to our mind at a time when, in fact, it's out of fashion. We could despair if we didn't know what God we were dealing with. It's the God of life. It's the God that loves this world and created it from love. It's the God that gave the world a new chance after the Great Flood and placed a rainbow in the sky as a sign of God's eternal covenant and said, as long as it exists, summer and winter, day and night, planting and harvest, all of that will not cease. It is the God who led the slaves into the promised land with a strong hand. It's the God who accompanied his people, even in exile in Babylon, and again opened the way for them to go home. If we want to understand what it means today to come home, we only have to remember these wonderful words of Isaiah. He gives us a sense of why a just world is our true home, the home to which we move. In our hearts, Isaiah plants the understanding of why justice, righteousness is the safest, indeed the only way to a good life. The prophet allows us to feel in our souls why those who have hungered and thirst after justice will finally be filled. And at the moment, we are concerned to find a more just world, politically, of course, and it is a good idea to have expert opinions, wise ideas, empirical statistics, but it's also about neither more nor less than a conversion. Every day, it's a matter of being more deeply converted to understanding what is the truth here and what makes life worth living. It's about this profound feeling of happiness, not against other people, but living in harmony with them. It's about the lovely knowledge that there's enough in the world for everyone and that everybody can live with dignity. It's about this wonderful experience that there are things that are greater the more we give them away and share them. Love is one of them. Solidarity. And personal happiness. That's also one of them. It grows when we share it. The great conversion that's waiting for us so that justice can prevail in our hearts, minds, and souls. This is a conversion towards our own happiness. So, remembering the promise of Isaiah, let us build a new world. And here we can trust that our light will be seen in the darkness. And our darkness will be like noon. And the Lord will always lead us and fill us in the drought and strengthen our bones. And we really will be like a watered garden and like a fountain of water that never dries up. Joining in this procession of justice, in this pilgrimage of justice and peace, continuing with this and knowing that the splendor of the Lord will be the conclusion. That is a good life in its purest form.
Wir hören noch einmal den Chor.
Now we'll hear the choir again.
To go to heaven is a wonderful place, filled with glory and grace. I want to see my Savior's face. Heaven is a wonderful place. I want to go to heaven is a wonderful place, filled with glory and grace. I want to see my Savior's face. Heaven is a wonderful place. I want to go to heaven is a wonderful place, filled with glory and grace. I want to see my Savior's face. Heaven is a wonderful place. Heaven is a wonderful place, filled with glory and grace. I want to see my Savior's face. Heaven is a wonderful place. It's a wonderful place.
So geht nun hin in diesen Tag im Frieden.
So let us go into this day in peace and with God's blessing.
Der Herr segne euch und behüte euch.
The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.
Amen.
Amen.
Begrüßen Sie mit mir jetzt auch Herrn Bundesminister Altmaier.
Let us welcome our Federal Minister Altmaier, the Minister for Environmental Affairs.
Hier ist was ich sonst in der Ökumene gar nicht so kenne.
Now, here's something I'm not familiar with, and that is a strict time management, because we have to finish at 11 sharp so that the next forum can move on to the stage as fast as possible. So we're going to work very concentratedly. First of all, we have stewards standing in the aisles. They're waving with slips of paper and pens. If you have any questions, you're invited to write them down, and the spokespersons of the audience will collect them and bring them to the panel. There are 2 rounds before that of the panel, and then we'll have the audience involved in the 3rd round. Now we're going to have a look at some photos which will bring it home to us what we're talking about.
Ja, das sind Bilder, die uns stumm werden lassen.
Those photos, of course, take our breath away. They're very affecting because they show what an unstable situation we're in at the moment.
Das ist so in Nordafrika, das ist so
That's the case in North Africa, in
Eritrea,
Afghanistan, in Eritrea, in
Ich lasse es
Syria.
erst einmal bei dieser Aufzählung.
I'll
Und da
just leave
machen
it at
sich
that.
natürlich Menschen auf den Weg.
And of course,
in großer
people
Zahl.
are setting out in
Ganz
large
wenige
numbers.
davon kommen eigentlich nur
Very few of them
bei
are
uns
actually arriving in Germany.
Wir wissen, dass die Interventionen der USA,
And we know that the
der
interventions
NATO,
of the United
von
States, of
Russland
NATO,
letztendlich
Russia
die westliche Welt also mitverantwortlich
and
ist für das,
the
was sich
Western
da
world
im
as such
Augenblick
is ultimately responsible
abspielt. Und wir
for
wissen,
what
wir
is
haben
being
es
played
gerade
out.
noch mal sehr
And we
ermutigend
know
gehört,
and
dass es zu
have
unserem
heard it again in a very
christlichen
encouraging way
Selbstverständnis
that in terms of our
gehört,
Christian
den
sense of
Fremden eine
identity,
Heimat zu geben, sie
it's our
aufzunehmen,
job
dass
to
uns
give
eigentlich das
strangers a
ganze
home,
Alte Testament erinnert,
to take
dass
them in.
unsere
And the whole of the
Glaubensgeschichte
Old
auch eine
Testament reminds us that the history of our faith is one of migration.
Christen tragen hier in der Tat
We
eine
Christians
besondere
indeed
Verantwortung.
bear special
Ich bin sehr
responsibility.
dankbar
I'm very grateful that in a very satisfying and gratifying way in our churches, particularly here in Westphalia, this has been felt and put into practice. We heard about it last night too. And there's an excellent culture of discussion between the church and the different authorities and ministries here in the German state of North Rhine-Westphalia. There's a high level of consensus, ultimately with the politicians at the border as well. However, we're seeing the situation is changing at the moment. We are very grateful for the stance taken by the German Federal Chancellor.
Der Satz, wir schaffen das, stimmt nämlich immer noch.
Her phrase, we'll manage, is still true. We will manage if we want to. And the restrictions to managing are far less than people think. So many thanks for all your commitment. And with respect to the culture of welcome that we've experienced here in Germany and which is being assisted in political terms, we still have to listen to what other people are saying at the moment. And as a reaction to that, there's a new set of laws called the Asylum Package 2. There's the lengthening of the list of so-called safe states of origin. There are restrictions now for family reunification. There's a deal with Turkey to retain refugees there. And Federal Minister Peter Altmaier, in all this discussion, do you think that the right to asylum, which is enshrined in the German constitution, do you think that that is in danger at all? What's your opinion? Well, thank you, Mr. Hinz, moderator, Bishop, everybody. I shall be brief.
Als wir im September vor der Situation standen, dass
last September in 2015, when we faced the situation that of the 60 million refugees in the world, 30,000 were in Greece, 30,000 on the Balkan route, and 30,000 in Hungary, these were all desperate under terrible humanitarian conditions. So we understood this was only a fraction of the whole. And so we quickly asked how politicians should respond. And I think that it's in the history of every country and every people. But also, there is a moment in the life of those with political and public responsibility when they stop for a minute and stop discussing things and simply follow their personal impulse to help. And this was a decision that the Federal Chancellor Angela Merkel didn't take by herself with a couple of ministers, but rather it was supported by the majority of people in Germany. They all wanted to see this happen. And I myself am very grateful and joyful. This was one of the better moments of our common life and history.
Der zweite Punkt. Der zweite Punkt ist,
secondly,
dass uns damals auch schon klar war, dass es natürlich
it was clear to us then as well. Of course, hundreds of thousands were to be assisted on their way to Europe, and they wanted to come to Germany. But nowadays, we have to realize that the problem is a lot larger and broader. In the Middle East alone, there are between 10 and 15 million refugees, many still in Syria as IDPs, and many, 6 million in Lebanon and 3 million in Turkey. And we have to turn to these people and try and improve their lives. And what we've been working on the whole time has meant that the food rations have been raised to the former level around Easter. That's the UN money had run out in the Middle East. And in Jordan and Lebanon, those in the camps can now be properly fed. In January, we managed to ensure that 2.5 million Syrian refugees can legally work in Turkey with social protection. can, perhaps not as thorough as here in Germany, but some kind of protection. And with the money made available by the European Union, we managed to ensure that finally, after 4 years of civil war, 3 million refugees, including thousands of children, they can go to school in Turkey. Schools have been built and hospitals for their families. But there's not just Syria and Turkey and the Middle East. There are 60 million refugees worldwide. And that's the third point. If we consider what has been done in the last few years, not just in Germany, but in Europe, it wasn't always so good, but some of it was. And I think that now that the major refugee crisis was focused on Lampedusa and Malta in 2008 and 2009, we didn't do enough about it at the time, and we left it to specialist ministers. And I think it's quite right that it's not just we'll manage that Angela Merkel has said, but she sees that there has to be a large level of coordination, and that has been now raised from specialist portfolios to the boss, so to speak, the Federal Chancellor herself. And I would really like to thank the churches and the whole of the society. The helpfulness of the volunteers was amazing. In October, we thought they would have been exhausted by then, having started in September, and that would all collapse. But a few weeks ago, and Heinrich Bedford-Strom was with me, and St. John's Ambulance and Maltesians and others reported to us in the Red Cross that the level of assistance was as high as it had been 6 months ago. And people who'd never been abroad, never even dreamt of going to the Middle East, suddenly they were helping people right and left, taking the refugees to German classes, taking them to the authorities, assisting them in practical ways. And I think that when we talk about volunteering in the next few years, it will be great to look back at this moment. And when people are willing to do it now, they have the opportunity. If this challenge, which has dipped a little bit at the moment because of the fact that no new refugees are coming, but this enthusiasm with those that are here has inspired people, and it's continuing to do so. And to come to your question about the state's reaction to the right to asylum, the question was, how can we organize the assistance so that it concentrates on those who particularly need it? Article 16 of the German Constitution, political refugees shall enjoy the right to asylum. Well, we've always applied that to cases, for example, of circumcision, of female genital mutilation, homosexuals, sundry other examples. We've always applied that in these extreme cases for those who are completely destitute as well. But hundreds and thousands of such people have come to Germany in the last 12 months. Each of them a human being, and they wanted to be assisted, not just with comforting words, but they wanted to be able to submit their applications for asylum. And after that, if they were successful, they wanted to fetch their families. All of that's understandable. And so we in the government said we'd like to concentrate on those who have the greatest need. So if anyone comes from a country like Macedonia, Serbia, or Bosnia-Herzegovina, where the judges say in 99% of the cases that their asylum application is not well-founded because there's no political persecution in those countries, because these countries are ruled by the rule of law, and they want to be members of the European Union, then I would like these individuals to recognize that they cannot acquire a residence permit in Germany through becoming an asylum seeker. And I would stand by that in every single case. It's not easy to deport them, but we said we don't mind if they come and work legally. That's a different thing than applying to be a refugee, applying for asylum. In other words, people from the Balkan countries, if they find a job in Germany, can come to Germany. We just don't want them to do this via the right to asylum under German law or the Geneva Refugee Convention, because there are enough people who are really persecuted and they have to be given priority.
Herr Bischof Bedford-Strom, ich frage Sie jetzt noch mal aus kirchlicher Sicht.
Thank you. Now, Bishop Bedford-Strom, I'll ask you a churchy question. You're not responsible for real politics, but you're very interested. Now, how do you judge this question? The individual cases, you mentioned that. And do you think we cope with the individual cases sufficiently? You're quite right, Realpolitik is not my field. But I like to say, if you have a social ethic that only works when you don't use it, then it's a poor social ethic. So it's very important to me, while we're sitting here discussing asylum or other things, not to take the moral high ground and tell the politicians what to do, looking down on them. Rather, I think there are things that concern us. Having said that, with respect to the tightening of asylum regulations, there are several points that the Evangelical Church in Germany has been critical of. And one is something you've already mentioned, that is family reunification. That's a point where I think we churches can have a special concern, and it needs to be said again. We're an international ecumenical network, and that means that we don't just bring people together from all countries and continents, as we have here in Westphalia, in a wonderful way, but rather we can listen to their stories. We have direct contact with the people in the countries from where the refugees come. And often I get cries for help in my email account from real people. And when I've been traveling, I meet them. I remember some of them. They remained in my mind and heart, and I wonder what happened to them. And some of them are very worried about their families. I get emails where people beg me, plead with me to do something to get their families over here in safety. And these are not luxury stories. It's a matter of life and death very often. And unfortunately, people did lose their lives because they weren't got out of the country in good time. In a situation like that, we churches have to advocate for people no longer staying in this danger and look for ways where they can come to Europe legally or in a safe way. The neighboring countries to the crisis areas, and this has been mentioned, have already received millions of people. And even after the Turkey deal, it's still a case that in Germany and in Europe, all of us are obliged to stand by people who are in immediate need. You may have seen a very touching film called The Children of Aleppo just recently. There's a family which is ever so touching and impressive, especially the children. There's a family that's still alive, we have to say that, because it obtained a legal visa through the Turkish embassy, and that's how the family was able to leave. And I heard of cases where it wasn't possible, and people died on the high seas. And that's why I come to the point that's most important to me today. That's why it's so important. Whatever we think about the deal between Europe and Turkey, and I think it's very good that now the people smugglers have had their hands tied. But the other part of the deal has to be carried out, and that would be that real quotas could be created and that people could come to Europe without putting themselves at such risk. And that's not the case at the moment. But that was part of the deal. It hasn't been carried out. And many people who urgently need to come aren't able to. So my big request and demand is that we do not tire in Germany of persuading the other countries in Europe to take their share, but not to say ourselves, thank goodness now we have a breather, but rather use the time to think about ways of helping people in immediate need. Thanks very much.
Das Stichwort Europa ist schon gefallen. Frau Peschke, Sie wissen genau die Ursachen.
You've just mentioned Europe. Now I turn to Doris Peschke from the Church of Commission for Migrants in Europe. Now you're very familiar with all of this, and you know that the numbers suffering from floods and droughts have grown, and Europe is sealing off its borders. So what does that mean from your European view?
Ja, ich denke, dass wir im Moment tatsächlich feststellen müssen, dass das Grundrecht auf
Well, I think
Asyl,
that at the moment we really should
das ja
note
nur besteht,
that
wenn eine Person schon in
the
Europa angekommen
constitutional
ist.
right to asylum only applies once you're
Gefährdet wird
here,
dadurch, dass wir
once you've set foot on a
vorverlagern
European
den
soil.
Flüchtlingsschutz in andere Länder und
But
dass wir Länder zu
we
sicher
have to protect the
erklären,
refugees
die es
at
nicht
an
sind.
earlier stage in other countries.
Bei der Türkei ist es ganz klar,
In Turkey,
es ist
for
kein
example, it's
sicheres
clear it's not
Herkunftsland,
really
gar
a
nicht,
safe
weil es,
country of origin, not at all,
Konflikte im Land
because there's a war going on
Es
there
ist
in
aber
that
auch
very
für
same country,
Flüchtlinge nicht automatisch sicher.
and it's not automatically
Es
safe for the
stimmt, für die
refugees
syrischen
either.
Flüchtlinge ist
It's
in
true,
den Verhandlungen
for the
einiges
Syrian
erreicht
refugees,
worden,
something was
aber
achieved in
es
the
ist nach wie vor
negotiations
ein
with Turkey,
temporärer Schutz,
but
das heißt
it's
kein
still temporary protection.
dauerhafter Flüchtlingsstatus.
It's not a lasting
Und für die
refugee
anderen
status.
Flüchtlinge, die durch die
And for the other
Türkei
refugees
nach Europa gekommen sind, aus
who
Afghanistan zum Beispiel,
have come to Europe
die auch
from
in Griechenland
Afghanistan, for
angekommen
example,
sind,
through Turkey,
gibt es
and
keinen
arrived in
Schutzstatus
Greece.
der Türkei. Und
There's
gerade in den
no
letzten Wochen
protective
haben wir
status in
gehört, dass
Turkey.
doch
And
viele
last week we
Personen
heard
nach
that
Afghanistan abgeschoben
many
worden sind.
people
Insofern
were
ist es eine
deported to
sehr
Afghanistan.
schwierige Situation, wenn Menschen den
So
Zugang
it's a difficult
zum
situation
Asylrecht nicht
when
bekommen
people
und die Frage
don't have
nach
access to
Kontingenten
the right to asylum.
ebenfalls
And the question
unzureichend
about
beantwortet wird, der
quotas
Größenordnung entsprechend.
is answered
Herr Altmaier hat schon
inadequately in
gesagt,
terms
wir
of the
haben
numbers.
60 Millionen
The Minister Peter
Vertriebene,
Altmaier said that we have
2 Drittel
60
sind in
million
ihren Ländern,
refugees, and 2/3 of them are still in the same country.
internationale Flüchtlinge,
1/3
das
are
sind
considered
20
international
Millionen.
refugees, that's 20
Und da
million.
braucht es internationale
And
Antworten, wo auch die
So
europäischen
international
Antworten
responses are called
sich
for,
eher einklinken müssten, als das derzeit der Fall ist.
and
Im
the Europeans
Moment
should
geht
get more
es
involved than they are at the
auf
moment.
Abschiebung, auf
At the
Reduzierung
moment, they're
der
more interested in
Flüchtlingsaufnahme in
reducing
Europa.
the reception
Und
of
das ist
refugees
vom
and
Grundsatz her
of
falsch.
deporting where they can.
Man kann es
But
noch
that's the
mit
wrong approach.
Finanzzahlen belegen.
This can be proven
Ich nehme
financially.
jetzt nur die Zahl, die ich auch im Kopf habe. Man kann das dann
Just
auch
to
noch
take the
wahrscheinlich
example
weiterrechnen. Es hat
of the
sich
figures
etwas
that I know,
verbessert. Bei
things
der
have improved slightly.
Migrationsagenda im Mai
With the
letzten
migration
Jahres, als
agenda of May
ein
2015,
Nothilfeprogramm beschlossen wurde,
which was an
wurden
emergency
16
program,
Millionen für Grenzschutz, Frontex,
16 million euros were
solche
allocated for
Notmaßnahmen
Frontex,
ausgegeben
that is protecting the European borders,
135.000 fürs
and
Asylunterstützungsprogramm.
135,000
Wissend,
to
dass
support
80%
the asylum
der
support
Menschen, die
office,
ankamen, Flüchtlinge sind,
knowing
kann
that
ich dieses
80%
nicht
of the
nachvollziehen.
refugees, 80% of the people arriving are refugees. This disparity of the figures
Wenn
says it
Sie
all.
uns an einem oder maximal 2 Beispielen aus Sicht der Betroffenen noch einmal verdeutlichen würden, wo im
Now,
Augenblick aus Ihrer
Volker
Sicht
Maria Hugo
gerade
from
viele
Pro Asyl, could you give us some examples of the people that you assist, just to illustrate the issue regarding the basic right to asylum in Germany? Well, just a preliminary comment.
Es gilt die UN-Kinderrechtskonvention in Deutschland.
The UN
vollständig.
Convention on the Rights of the Child is respected in Germany, but nevertheless, when I come from the wrong country, I have a problem as a child or an adolescent. I'm in a camp, I'm not allowed to go to school or have training. I get less assistance, which is against a statement by the German Federal Constitutional Court of 2012. Children have to be seen as fully fledged persons and given their rights. And this way of separating the sheep from the goats is something I cannot stand. That is, depending on which country you come from, you're treated as an asylum seeker or not.
Ich habe mich sehr wohl gefühlt, als ich Ihnen zugehört habe, Herr Altmaier.
And
Das Problem ist, wenn ich
in
die
addition,
Gesetze
I enjoyed
reingucke,
listening
die
to the
parallel
minister
dazu erlassen
before.
werden, dann sieht die
But if I
Situation
look at the
anders
laws
aus. Wir sehen
that have
auf den
been
Kurs,
passed, I think
Abschreckungspolitik
things look a
zu
bit
machen.
different.
Und das ist
I
nicht in
personally
Ordnung,
think
denn
we're
es
all
geht um
set to deter.
Menschenrechtsverletzungen. Und eins ist auch
And that's
klar,
not right. It's about violations of human rights. And one thing is clear, most of the people who come to Germany will remain for the foreseeable future. We've defined 2 large groups. Those who have good chances of remaining: Iran, Iraq, Eritrea, and Syria. But what about Somalia? What about Ethiopia? There are many countries. Afghanistan, there's even a discussion in Germany as to whether that could be considered a safe country of origin. It's simply not realistic to see it so.
Was sind die wichtigsten Fragen, die Flüchtlinge haben? Teile
So,
haben wir schon gehört.
what are the main questions that they have? We've heard the answers, of course. When can I fetch my family, for example? Part of the problem is that the asylum procedures take ages.
Meldung als Asylsuchender rum. Und dann stellen sie
Sometimes
fest, oh,
they
sie
wait
haben
for a year
Verfahren.
to see some kind of result after the lodging of their first application. And then it's discovered that it's a Dublin case, which means they have to be sent back to where they first set foot in Europe, which might be Hungary or Bulgaria or Greece. And that's nonsense. That whole system is quite ineffective. They should have a free choice. And if we talk about integration, that means speak German well, earn your living, and don't get into trouble with the police. But why don't we talk about what it means in our forum today, giving people refuge and a home? In this whole discussion about integration, I never hear people talking about having a prospect of staying. People have to know they've arrived. If you say everything is temporary, they won't want to integrate. It's not conducive to it. It's that simple. And what bothers refugees if they can't take an integration course early, if they can't learn German early? German as a foreign language is rather difficult to teach. When people arrive and they just speak in the street, it's hard to get a pupil finally who speaks poorly because they've just picked it up in the street. In other words, the language courses should be from the start. And even if a person does have to go, is deported, then at least they can take some knowledge of the German language with them, which is helpful perhaps in life. So there's a sorting that goes on. If people want to work, you then run them down too and say that's all they came for. And personally, I think not allowing people to work is against the UN Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, of which our minister recently said Germany hadn't ratified it. That's nonsense. It's been ratified since 1976. And it's very fine that we have such rights, that everybody should have free access to work. And telling people they can't work is against international law. And I come back to where I started. Giving children such a poor start in life is also illegal. The moderator reminds the audience that they're invited to write their questions down. Afterwards, we'll sort them out and level them at the members of the panel. So the question now is,
Nöte, Defizite, auch Herr Altmaier, ja eingeräumt. Das ist eine Erste-Hilfe-Maßnahme, so habe ich ihn.
We've seen first aid going on, if you like. We haven't heard the whole program in dealing with the refugees, looking at the minister. But what should happen so that the human right to asylum can be put into practice better? And what can the churches do to assist?
Naja, also ich glaube schon,
das war jetzt Herr Altmaier. Okay. Ich hatte zunächst bei Herrn Bedford-Strom, lassen Sie noch mal beginnen. Sie sind
Well, why don't we start with the churchman? There's some confusion. Yes, all right. The most important thing is the things that have already been mentioned. For integration, a certain action has to be taken by politicians, first of all. There has to be security of prospects of staying. It's nothing worse if you're sitting around and not knowing what's going to happen. So the whole procedures have to be speeded up. And that is a political demand, speeding up the handling of the request for asylum. I spoke to the director of the Office for Migrants and Refugees recently. He said they're doing their best here. It's very important that the refugees then can be given some status so they can begin to contribute to society. Now, we in the church have also invested many millions. The member churches of the 20 members of the Evangelical Church in Germany, which is a federation, have invested 20 million in order to provide full-time coordinators for the volunteers. For example, German courses that take place regularly. These are all things that we can do, and where a bit of money and policy assistance can help. But the second and important point is for people to continue to be volunteers. And that's what I said this morning during the devotions and what the minister confirmed. It's so important that the volunteers realize, and I think this is a spiritual question, that the refugees are all created in the image of God, as we believe is the case for absolutely everyone. And that, of course, motivates us. Now, Doris Peschke, what do you think? Well, sorry, the bishop would like to add something. But that's exactly what we're trying to do. And there are a few people sitting here from European churches. In Germany, we've held various conferences to try and get church representatives together so that in their respective countries, they can be something like the salt of the earth and light of the world, so that we in Europe, as churches, can take the clear line that refugees have to be welcomed and received. It's precisely what the church should do. Now back to the minister. What are the next necessary steps? On the 24th of May, in 2 weeks, we're going to adopt a new integration law. And that won't just assist those who are recognized and have the right to stay. We'll also see that other groups can have language teaching, for example. We'll also see to it that those who would like to do vocational training can stay not just to the end of their training, but 2 years later, even if they haven't got asylum. And then we'll consider their case. So we have focused on these special groups. And 2 years ago, when we made the first list of safe countries of origin, we said that regardless of whether the refugee was recognized or not, they could work 3 months after applying for their application. And this is something that the NGOs tell us all the time, represented here by Doris Peschke and Volker Maria Hügel. We can't do everything that you demand, but we do quite a bit where it's necessary and possible. And finally, you all have the right and the duty, no doubt, to bombard us with your wishes and demands. I'm not complaining about that. But on the other hand, though, I know that what Joachim Gauck, the German federal president, said, our willingness to help is unlimited, but our resources are limited. And you come up against the limits every day. When Volker Maria Hügel says they should all learn German, but I say there aren't so many trained German teachers. We're asking pensioners to come back at the moment. When we get them lined up, we'll be able to multiply the number of German courses. We're planning to do that by the end of the year. But the number of teachers isn't endless. To do it with some quality. And 1,500 staff has been increased to 6,000 staff working with the recognition authority in order to speed things up. It's difficult, not just legally, but practically. It's difficult. You don't want to rubber stamp the applications. Time has to be spent considering the issues in every single case. But we're trying to do our best. And if I may say, through cooperation with Turkey, we have in no way passed any judgment on press freedom, rights for the opposition, newspapers, freedom of speech and so on in Turkey. The Federal Chancellor has made this clear. But it's also true that Turkey, having granted 3 million refugees sanctuary, and that wasn't easy for it. Many of them were leaving because they had many problems there. And it was our concern to improve the fate of this group, especially the young people and the children. And I promise you one thing. Last week, I had a talk with Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. We had a long chat in the Chancery, and we said, we won't just leave things to the police in Turkey or Frontex to stop people coming, and often people die on the seas because they are not looked for and so on. But we say when people arrive, they will be given a quick decision in some cases. They can be sent back. if they don't get asylum. And we expect Turkey to treat these refugees, even after their rejection, in a humanitarian way, as written in the Geneva Refugee Conference. For Syrians, this is happening. For example, we're not going to send anybody back unless this guarantee has been signed, because we also feel responsible for the people whom we may have to send back to Turkey from Greece. Now, just quickly, Doris Peschke, what about the EU? Well, I think the same, really. Like Germany, the EU should provide more security. The regulations keep changing. That is, people giving advice often don't know where they stand. When they came from Hungary, Turkey, other countries, it's hard to find solutions or alternative solutions for them because of the changes in regulations. And it's also difficult for the solidarity that was expressed by many countries last summer to be put into practice. Relocation is really very hesitant at the moment. The hotspots are 2 to 3 times fuller than they should be in Greece, in the islands, and so on. And there's urgent need to move people out of those hotspots, these emergency reception centers. And mainly, these are family members of refugees who have succeeded in entering other European states and can stay there. So 25,000 of these refugees should be brought from Greece by the summer, in our opinion. It should be possible to check the family connections and then distribute these family members stuck in Greece to the other countries. It would be really good if that could happen in summer so that the new cases could be dealt with, because there's such a backlog of old cases. And also, the proposals that came from the European Commission last week shouldn't just aim at deterrence. There should be more concern for reception and the question of quotas, and more persuasion aimed at the other states so that they could take some, and it not just being dictated. There was a list set up last year, and many states in the EU just refused to take their quota. If they were persuaded properly, we might make some progress. But I don't think the proposals presented by the European Union are terribly practical at the moment. Frauke Maria Hübel from Pro Asyl. Well, I think a first step we should take is to get away from this idea of defense, the law of defensiveness, that we assume all the time that the foreigner is a problem. It's often the attitude. The cities that put the whole issue in the Department of Social Affairs have had better results. It's simply because somebody who's interested in the social side of life rather than the legal side deals with them a lot more kindly. And if you've ever experienced what deportation is like, when the doorbell's at 4 a.m., 10 police enter the flat, into the apartment, you have to pack your bags in 20 minutes and get out. That's so shocking. And the minority on the Balkans, those are the forgotten victims of the Holocaust. If we just imagine for a minute that we might have dealt with Jews in the same way we deal with the Roma, thank goodness, with respect to anti-Semitism, we're very sensitive in Germany. But why are we not sensitive in the attitude to the Roma, to the Gypsies? So what else should we do? My last sentence. I think that it's crucial not just to strengthen the authorities, but to build up the whole advice structure.
Der hat damals schon die
A few years
richtigen
ago,
Forderungen
we
im
had
Kühn-Memorandum
a man called
aufgestellt.
Heinz Kuhn who
Was wir erreichen
wrote
müssen,
down the right demands
ist
in
alles, was
his
ausgrenzt,
manifesto.
weg.
What we need
Alles, was
is to
reinholt,
remove
muss gestärkt
everything
werden.
that
Gleiche
excludes
Rechte für Ausländer
and
und
to
Deutsche. Das war so
strengthen
revolutionär
integration.
im
The
September
same rights for
1979,
Germans
dass beim Umzug
and,
der Regierung von Bonn nach Berlin, die
and
dieses
in
Memorandum in Bonn haben liegen lassen.
1979, that was convincing. That was many years ago. Never has anybody been so clever in knowing what to do with respect to integration. Treat people equally at eye level, and then they'll have good chances.
Und ich muss mal sagen, es ist ein großer Vorteil in einem Land,
Well, many thanks.
dass man so miteinander
That has been a very committed
ist auch was,
debate,
worauf man
and
stolz
it is a
sein
great advantage to be in a country that allows us to be so
kann.
frank.
Frage von vielen zusammengefasst aus dem Publikum.
One question of the many that I've collected from or you've collected rather, from the whole audience.
Ja, wir haben
Anwälte des Publikums.
These are the spokespersons of the public, of the audience. It's a question to the Minister, Peter Altmaier. Many people are worried about this deal with Turkey.
Wie sieht die Situation in Idomeni aus? Wie kann diese
What's the situation like in Idomeni in Greece? How can the situation be solved in a humanitarian way?
Und wie sieht es mit
And what about the Kurdish question in Turkey
regelmäßigen Abschiebungen
and the regular deportation
aus, die von der
to
Türkei
Syria
aus geschehen? Also wie kann
from
insgesamt
Turkey?
die Bundesregierung sicher sein, dass die
So how can the federal government be certain that its claim to observe human rights is in
Wir
fact
haben
met?
zunächst einmal, was Idomeni angeht,
Well, regarding the border town of Idomeni, the situation is that we always said at the European level, we want to thwart the people smugglers, and if countries have to close their borders, then they should do it.
Das waren die Vereinbarungen mit der Türkei. Es kam dann dazu,
And the way we got around that was to have this agreement with Turkey.
ihre Grenzen früher geschlossen haben.
Austria and Macedonia closed their borders earlier. That meant that 50 to 60,000 people were stranded in Greece. And I'd like to say very plainly, people with prospects of protection who are amongst these refugees, and it's a large number, are to be given the opportunity of resettlement and relocation. We also said that we would provide decent accommodation. People are building that all the time. Nobody has to live in mud. In Idomeni has been the case lately. And secondly, in the last few years, when we made mistakes, there was one perhaps, relocation, apart from asylum, was not sufficiently discussed. When I worked in the Interior Ministry from 2005 to 2009, over 2,500 refugees were brought from Iraq, willingly, voluntarily, without any life danger, without any people traffickers and so on. Unfortunately, we haven't done enough of that since. We should rediscover a European culture of resettlement. That would save us a lot of this hassle with people smugglers. But we have to cope with their presence at the moment, and the agreement with Turkey wasn't just in the interest of Turkey or the interest of Europe, but it was the interest of human beings, because 10 to 15 million people have fled in the region. I said that before, and no one can realistically think that these 15 million are all going to come to Europe in the next few months. And that's why their situation has to be improved locally. And that's our responsibility too. We feel responsible for those who are waiting before the Turkish border in northern Syria, and also for those in Lebanon and Jordan. And that means providing food, healthcare, access to school, access to jobs, and, if I may say so, we also look at the criticism, the question of whether refugees have been sent back to Syria. That does not relate to those that we might send back in the framework of the agreement, because we haven't sent back any applicants, because they're still in Greece. during their procedure. But those who are in Turkey, we have a close look at them before they're sent back. And when I spoke to Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch about this, I said, we will examine Amnesty's criticisms about maltreatment of Syrians in Turkey. And we're in close contact with the UNHCR. And I must say that in this crisis at the moment, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees is doing a wonderful job. We're going to do everything to support it. Thank you, Minister. And please take our best wishes and thanks back to the Chancellor.
Auch aus dieser Runde mit.
Thanks for her clear position.
Eine Frage aus dem Publikum, kurz und knapp.
Another question. A question to Ms. Peschke. What proposals do the European churches make regarding safe and legal pathways to Europe instead of the perilous trip via the Mediterranean? Yes, we are indeed in favor of safe and legal pathways to Europe. Resettlement is one way. It's already been mentioned. And yesterday, another program was presented from Italy, where refugees can come from Lebanon to Europe with church sponsorship. There are quotas for certain groups, and we think that negotiating these groups are an excellent alternative or addition, really, to the resettlement program. And we need time to spend on legal work, opportunities for people from the Balkan countries in order to relieve the weight of asylum applications. And we shouldn't just think about this, we should put it into practice. That means protection in the regions is not against asylum and receiving refugees, but it has to be done together. Only then will we really be able to improve the refugees' situation. And that's why we have to persuade people that it's not just a matter of keeping them out, but there have to be ways of bringing refugees in. And the European Parliament will decide an article on this in June, we hope, and this has to be agreed, of course, with the Council, to enable refugees to be able to go somewhere else, so that asylum seekers can be dealt with in Europe.
Eine Frage an Herrn Hügel.
Das Problem wird angesprochen, dass Menschen trotz vorbildlicher Integration, trotz des Votums der Härtefallkommission oder des Petitionsausschusses abgeschoben werden.
Despite all the efforts made and the petitions that are presented to the parliamentary commissions, people are still being deported, removed from the country. What can we do to help them without clogging up the works politically? Well, I think in cities where NGOs can talk on an equal footing with the authorities, sometimes you make progress. Of course, you have to have authorities that permit it, but then you won't get these sorts of very painful deportations. In regions where this is difficult, where the advice centres aren't supported by the municipality, where there's opposition between the local authority and the NGOs, then you can't do much. And then the hardship committee is powerless, because if the city doesn't want to keep a person, then it's impossible to say that they can be kept at a higher level. Münster is a particularly good example. The city of Münster moved the immigration department of the city into the Social Affairs Committee, so the decision is then taken by the Social Affairs Director, and that's a lot more conducive to staying than in the case of a pure legal attitude. We're never really popular. We can be a pain in the neck for these people. It's usually the case, really. But what we do is speak for the refugees, and in many cases they're not given sufficient attention, and we give them a voice. And when we are listened to, then our chances are greater, and then we can do a great deal more for the refugees at the local level. Thanks very much. At this point, I'd like to say a big thank you to all of those who have carried out sanctuary in churches in the last few years with a lot of competence and patience. And the refugees involved generally were given asylum in the end. And I have to say that the churches were not harassed by the political bodies in North Rhine-Westphalia. A final question to the chair of the Evangelical Church in Germany. What is the Church doing about the restrictions and pressing for an immigration law? Well, for years we've been calling for a better immigration law. I had it in my report to the Synod last year, for example. If you look at this question carefully, sometimes you find it's rather a pseudo-discussion. This whole concept of immigration law is avoided by some people, even though it's perfectly clear that we need one. The bases are there, but the rules are under other headings in the law. I think it's very clear that Germany is a country of immigration, therefore it should have an immigration law. And it should be affirmed rather than repressed, this whole issue. And Doris Peschke has just said this. If we have possibilities for migration, then a lot of people wouldn't apply for asylum in the first place, which would make things easier in terms of numbers dealing with their cases. And the migrants could follow a certain law according to certain criteria. That's why we're all in favor of that.
Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists, to the spokespersons of the audience, the stewards, the interpreters, everyone. Everyone who's helped us to conclude our debate on time. We have to clear up here for the next event. It's my impression that it's been a very compact and meaty panel. And just to wrap up, recently, I was at a reception on the topic of refugees. It was thanking the volunteers, actually, run by our church. And they said, "You must be exhausted." But it's not true. Let me tell you now, the volunteers are refreshed by this. It's enriching to our lives. And that is the promise of Isaiah, as we heard at the beginning. I think we will continue in the church in assisting the refugees. In this work, we meet Christ himself. Many thanks. I will now hear the choir of the Student Christian Movement of the City of Münster and the African choir Celestial Echoes.
God is an awesome God. He reigns from heaven above with wisdom, power, and love. Our God is an awesome God. Our God is an awesome God. He reigns from heaven above with wisdom, power, and love. Our God is an awesome God. Our God is an awesome God. He reigns from heaven above with wisdom, power, and love. Our God is an awesome God. Our God is awesome. He reigns from heaven with wisdom, power, and wisdom. Our God is an awesome God. Our God is awesome. He reigns from heaven with wisdom, power, and wisdom. Our God is an awesome God. Our God is an awesome God. Our God is an awesome God.
And the Lord wasn't joking when he kicked them out of Eden. It wasn't for no reason that he shed his blood.
very soon, and so you better be believing that our God is an awesome God.
Yes, we know that it's awesome.
Our God is awesome.
And He
reigns from heaven
with power and wisdom.
power and wisdom. Our God is an awesome God.
And we know that it's awesome.
Our God is awesome.
And He reigns with power and wisdom.
Power and wisdom. Our God is an awesome God.
Now when the sky was starless in the dark of the night,
Our God is an awesome God.
He spoke unto the darkness and created the light.
Our God is an awesome God.
The judgment and wrath He poured out on Sodom, His mercy and grace He gave us at the cross. I know that we have not too quickly forgotten that
Our God is an awesome God. Our God is awesome.
And He reigns
From heaven
with power and wisdom.
power and wisdom. Our God is an awesome God.
We know that it does.
Our God is awesome.
He reigns
From heaven
with power and wisdom.
power and wisdom. Our God is an awesome God.
Our God is an awesome God. He reigns
From heaven above with wisdom, power and love. Our God is an awesome God. Our God is awesome. He reigns from heaven and wisdom, power and wisdom. Our God is an awesome God.
We know that is awesome.
Our God is awesome. He reigns from heaven
Power and wisdom.
power and wisdom. Our God is an awesome God. Our God is an awesome God.